When the United States Army Armored Divisions first rolled onto the scorched battlefields of North Africa in late 1942 and early 1943, they did so with the swagger of a force that believed it had already won the technological war, riding into battle inside the M4 Sherman, a 30-ton chariot of American industrial might that was hailed by the press and the generals alike as the greatest tank in the world. To the young crews who manned them, fresh from the training grounds of Fort Knox and the California desert, the Sherman was a masterpiece of automotive engineering, boasting a reliable radial engine that started every time, a gyro-stabilized 75mm main gun that could fire on the move, a feat no German tank could match, and sloped frontal armor that they were assured would deflect the standard enemy anti-tank rounds like rain off a tin roof. The early encounters with the Italians and the older German Panzer III and IV models seemed to confirm this hubris, as the Shermans chewed up the lighter Axis armor with relative ease, fostering a dangerous illusion that the war would be a simple exercise in superior mobility and firepower. However, this confidence was shattered into 1,000 burning fragments in the dusty passes of Tunisia, where the American tankers first laid eyes on a boxy, monstrous silhouette that would haunt their nightmares for the remainder of the war, the Panzerkampfwagen 6, known simply as the Tiger. The first encounter was not a battle, but a trauma, a collision between the optimistic theories of the Ordnance Department and the cold, hard physics of Krupp steel. In the confused, shifting engagements around the Faid Pass and later at Kasserine, American tank platoons spotted these massive 60-ton German behemoths lumbering across the valley floor and, following their training, moved to engage, expecting their high-velocity 75mm armor-piercing shells to punch through the vertical armor of the German giants, just as they had done with the smaller panzers. The American gunners laid their crosshairs on the flat, vertical plates of the Tiger's hull, a target that looked deceptively vulnerable compared to the sloped armor of the Sherman, and fired with precision from ranges of 800 to 1,000 yards. What happened next defied the Americans' understanding of ballistics and reality. Instead of the sparks of penetration and the billowing smoke of an internal explosion, the crews watched in horror as their solid steel shot simply shattered against the Tiger's hide or ricocheted harmlessly into the sky, leaving nothing but a gray smudge on the German camouflage paint. Inside the Sherman, the mood shifted instantly from aggression to panic as the commanders realized that their main gun, the best in the world, was effectively a pea shooter against a bank vault. The German response was terrifyingly leisurely as the Tiger crews, confident in their invulnerability, slowly traversed their heavy turrets to bring the feared 88mm KWK-36 gun to bear, a weapon originally designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers and capable of punching a hole through a Sherman from distances where the American tank appeared as nothing more than a speck in the optics. The sound of the 88mm was distinct, a sharp, cracking whip crack that arrived before the sound of the gun's report, and when the shell struck, it didn't just penetrate, it eviscerated. An American tank commander in Tunisia recalled watching the lead tank of his platoon take a hit from a Tiger sitting over a mile away, a distance considered impossible for accurate tank gunnery by U.S. standards, and the result was catastrophic. The Sherman didn't just stop, it violently disassembled, the turret torn from its race ring and thrown into the air as the ammunition stored loosely in the sponsons detonated instantly. This was the birth of Tiger phobia, a psychological contagion that spread through the armored ranks like a virus, where every German tank seen in the distance, whether it was a lowly Panzer IV or a Stug assault gun, was identified as a Tiger by terrified crews who knew that if it was a Tiger, they were already dead. The disparity in engagement ranges was the most demoralizing factor, for the Germans could kill at 2,000 meters, while the Sherman had to close to within 500 meters, effectively point-blank range, to have even a mathematical prayer of penetrating the Tiger's side or rear armor, a suicidal closing of the gap that required crossing a mile of open ground under withering fire. Despite the carnage in North Africa, the reports filtering back to Washington were sanitized or dismissed by right high-ranking officers, like Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the architect of the ground forces, who insisted that the 75mm gun was adequate and that the heavy German tanks were few in number and mechanically unreliable, a dangerous bureaucratic denial that meant no crash program to upgun the Sherman was initiated. The troops were told that their tactics were at fault, not their equipment, a lie that would be paid for in blood when the invasion of Europe began. As the surviving crews of the North African campaign looked toward the invasion of Sicily and eventually France, they did so with the grim, secret knowledge that they were driving vehicles that were obsolete before the paint had dried, and that their survival depended not on their armor, but on the hope that the German monsters would run out of gas before they ran out of targets. The illusion of American technological supremacy had died in the desert, replaced by the cold fear of the 88mm, and the realization that for the U.S. tankers, the war had just become a contest of quantity over quality, where they would have to offer up 5 of their own blazing wrecks to buy the death of a single German cat.
As the Allied armies pushed deeper into the suffocating, claustrophobic lanes of the Norman Bocage in the summer of 1944, the nightmare that had begun in Tunisia with the Tiger mutated into a ubiquitous plague with the widespread encounter of the Panzerkampfwagen 5, or the Panther, a machine that shattered the last vestiges of American armored confidence and revealed the M4 Sherman to be a death trap of terrifying fragility. While the Tiger was a rare, heavy beast, a hangar queen often broken down behind the lines or deployed only in heavy tank battalions, the Panther was the new main battle tank of the Wehrmacht, sleek, fast, and protected by a sloping frontal glacis plate that was a masterpiece of ballistic deflection, copying the geometry of the Soviet T-34, but executed with German metallurgical perfection. For the crews of the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, the realization that their standard 75mm armor-piercing rounds were bouncing off the front of the Panther even at point-blank range was a psychological breaking point, a moment where the physics of survival seemed to have been rewritten by the enemy. A Sherman gunner could put a round directly into the center of a Panther's chest from 200 yards, a shot that should have been a guaranteed kill, only to watch the tracer spark and careen steadily upward into the trees, leaving the German tank unharmed and slowly turning its turret to return fire with its long-barreled 75mm KWK-42 gun, a weapon with such high velocity that it could punch through the front of a Sherman, go through the engine block, and exit the rear. But the true horror of the Sherman was not just its inability to kill, it was its propensity to die in a specific, agonizing way that earned it the grim, black humor nicknames of Ronson among the Americans and Tommy Cooker among the Germans, a reference to the cheap portable stoves used by British troops. The myth persisted that the Sherman burned because it used a gasoline engine, while the Germans used diesel, but the terrifying truth lay in the internal architecture of the tank itself, specifically the ammunition storage. In the early and mid-production Shermans fighting in Normandy, the main gun rounds were stored in dry racks located in the sponsons, the shelves directly above the tracks on the side of the hull, the exact spot where enemy gunners were trained to aim. When a high-velocity German shell penetrated the relatively thin vertical side armor of the Sherman, it didn't just kill the crew with shrapnel, it ignited the propellant in the stored shells, creating a catastrophic overpressure event that turned the interior of the tank into a blast furnace within seconds. The flash fire would sweep through the fighting compartment with the violence of a blowtorch, temperatures soaring to 2,000 degrees instantly, incinerating oxygen and flesh alike before the crew even had time to scream. Survivors of these brew-ups spoke of the whoosh sound of the ammunition igniting, followed by the desperate struggle to claw their way out of the hatches while their uniforms melted to their skin, a frantic race against the inevitable detonation of the high-explosive warheads that would blow the turrets sky-high. The fear of burning alive became the dominant neurosis of the American tanker, leading crews to weld unauthorized extra steel plates onto the sides of their tanks or pile sandbags over the sponsons in a desperate, futile attempt to pre-detonate the German-shaped charges, tactics that often did little more than strain the transmission and offer a placebo of safety. The disparity in firepower was so grotesque that it warped the tactical doctrine of the U.S. Army. Tank commanders were forced to treat the Panther not as an equal, but as a boss fight in a video game that required cheating to win. They learned that to kill a Panther, they had to hit the gun mantlet, a curved piece of armor on the turret, and hope the shell deflected downward into the driver's compartment, a trap shot that relied more on luck than skill, or they had to flank it, a maneuver that was nearly impossible in the hedgerows where the Germans controlled the angles. The bitterness among the troops was directed not at the Germans, but at their own ordnance department, which continued to ship thousands of these steel coffins across the channel, valuing the ease of shipping and mass production over the lives of the men inside. Every time a Sherman column moved out, the crews sat on their helmets to protect their groins from shrapnel coming from below, kept their hatches unlatched to shave a second off their escape time, and watched the tree lines with the paranoid intensity of men who knew they were driving a rolling bomb that needed only a single spark to ignite. The Ronson was a weapon that required its users to accept a suicidally high probability of death by fire as the cost of doing business, creating a distinct, fatalistic culture within the armored divisions, where men stopped making long-term plans and simply focused on keeping the lighter from sparking for one more day. The hedgerows of Normandy were soon littered with the blackened, turretless husks of burned-out Shermans, their hulls glowing red in the twilight, serving as flaming mile markers on the road to Paris and as a silent indictment of a military bureaucracy that had sent its sons to fight lions with a weapon that was little more than a disposable lighter on tracks.
The slaughter of American tank crews in the hedgerows and the open plains of France was not merely a result of German engineering superiority, but the direct consequence of a deeply flawed intellectual concept hatched in the corridors of the War Department in Washington, a fatal strategic error known as the tank destroyer doctrine, whose chief architect was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. McNair, a brilliant but dogmatic artilleryman, championed a philosophy that dictated a strict division of labor on the battlefield. Tanks were designed solely to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs, while the destruction of enemy armor was the exclusive domain of specialized, lightly armored, open-topped vehicles known as tank destroyers, like the M10 Wolverine and the M18 Hellcat. According to the field manuals printed in the safety of the Pentagon, if a Sherman platoon encountered a German Tiger, they were supposed to retreat and radio for the tank destroyers to come forward and ambush the enemy, a theory that looked elegant on paper but was revealed to be a suicidal fantasy in the chaotic reality of combat. The Germans, fighting for their survival, did not adhere to American doctrine. Their panzers did not wait politely for the tank destroyers to arrive, nor did they ignore the Shermans. Instead, the heavy German cats aggressively hunted the American medium tanks, forcing the Sherman crews into tank-on-tank duels they were neither equipped nor trained to fight. The disconnect between McNair's theory and the bloody facts of the Falaise pocket was absolute. The tank destroyers were often miles away, stuck in traffic or suppressed by artillery fire due to their open turrets, leaving the Sherman platoons to face the Panthers and Tigers alone. This forced American commanders on the ground to improvise a desperate, high-cost tactic known as swarming, a brutal arithmetic of attrition that acknowledged the inferiority of their machines by trading lives for position. The standard equation, grimly accepted by the crews of the 3rd Armored Division, was that it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, 2 to die, 2 to distract, and 1 to kill. We witnessed this terrifying choreography in the fields near Argenton, where a platoon of 5 Shermans spots a single Tiger I parked at a crossroads, its 88mm gun dominating the terrain. The American commander knows he cannot penetrate the Tiger's 4-inch frontal armor, even at point-blank range, so he orders a mad-minute charge that is essentially a sacrificial ritual. 2 Shermans are ordered to charge directly at the Tiger, firing high-explosive shells not to penetrate, but to blind the German optics with smoke and dust, acting as live bait to draw the slow traverse of the German turret. It is a suicide mission, and the crews know it. As they roar forward, engines screaming, the Tiger's gun barks, that terrible, dry crack, and the lead Sherman is instantly turned into a fireball, its turret tumbling into the ditch. The Tiger's loader slams another shell into the breach, and the huge turret rotates slightly to vaporize the second attacker. But in those precious 30 seconds of carnage,
The remaining 3 Shermans have split up, racing through the mud to flank the German monster on the left and right. The Tiger commander, enclosed in his steel fortress, realizes too late that he is being swarmed. He can kill anything he looks at, but he cannot look everywhere at once. He frantically orders his driver to pivot the tank, but the Tiger is heavy and slow. One Sherman manages to get behind the hedgerow and emerge on the Tiger's flank, closing to within 300 yards. Here, finally, the 75mm gun has a chance. The gunner aims for the thinner armor above the road wheels or the engine deck at the rear. He fires. The shell penetrates. The Tiger shudders and stops, black smoke billowing from the engine vents as the crew bails out. The engagement is over. The Americans have won the crossroads, but the cost is 2 tanks destroyed and 10 men dead or horribly burned, all to eliminate a single enemy vehicle. Back at headquarters, the generals tallied these engagements as victories, pointing to the sheer number of German tanks destroyed as proof that the system was working. But for the men in the turrets, it was a bitter, hollow triumph. They realized they were being used as disposable ammunition, that their lives were being spent to compensate for the stubborn refusal of their superiors to provide them with a heavy tank capable of fighting the Germans on equal terms. The tank destroyer doctrine had failed, but the army refused to abandon it, leaving the Sherman crews to continue their grim mathematics of sacrifice, knowing that every time they saw a Tiger, some of them would have to die so that one of them could get the shot. This was not warfare of skill. It was a brawl where the American heavyweight was forced to fight with one hand tied behind his back, winning only because he had more blood to bleed than the enemy had bullets to fire.
By the autumn of 1944, as the leaves turned brown in the forests of the Ardennes and the Allied supply lines stretched to their breaking point, the crisis of American armor had evolved from a tactical embarrassment into a strategic scandal, fueled by the belated introduction of a weapon that was supposed to be the answer to the German Cats, but proved to be yet another tragic disappointment: the 76mm gun. For months, tank crews had been promised a new breed of Sherman, an upgunned variant that would finally allow them to punch through the frontal armor of a Panther without having to engage in suicidal flanking maneuvers. When the first M4A3 76W tanks arrived in the staging areas, with their long, slender barrels and T-23 turrets, the crews greeted them with the desperate enthusiasm of drowning men grasping at a lifeline, believing that the days of the ricochet were over. However, this hope was brutally extinguished in a series of secret test firings conducted near Isigny, France, ordered by General Eisenhower himself, who was growing increasingly suspicious of the optimistic reports from the Ordnance Department. The results of the test were a shock that reverberated all the way to the White House. Against a captured Panther tank, the new American 76mm anti-tank rounds shattered harmlessly against the sloped glacis plate of the German machine at virtually all combat ranges. The upgrade was a failure. The ordnance engineers had tested the gun against vertical armor plate, ignoring the simple geometric reality that the Panther's 55-degree slope effectively doubled the thickness of the steel. The American tanker was once again sent into the meat grinder with a lance that was shattered before the charge even began, forcing them to look with envy at their British allies who had solved the problem months ago with a ruthless pragmatism that Washington lacked. The British, not beholden to the rigid doctrine of the U.S. Army, had taken the Sherman and performed radical surgery on it, cutting a hole in the back of the turret to fit their massive, high-velocity 17-pounder anti-tank gun, creating a hybrid monster known as the Firefly. The Firefly was the only Allied tank in Normandy that could consistently drill a hole through a Tiger or a Panther at 1,000 yards, and the Germans knew it. Captured German intelligence manuals instructed Tiger commanders to identify the Sherman with the long barrel and the muzzle brake and destroy it first before engaging any other target. The fact that the British had a tank capable of killing the enemy, while the Americans, the industrial masters of the world, did not, was a source of bitter resentment among the GIs, who saw the refusal of the U.S. Ordnance Department to adopt the 17-pounder as a betrayal born of not-invented-here arrogance. Denied a gun that could kill by kinetic energy,
the American crews of the 76mm Shermans were forced to resort to a form of armored chemical warfare to survive the winter offensive of 1944. They discovered that while their armor-piercing shells bounced off the German Cats, their white phosphorus, or Willie Pete rounds, had a terrifyingly effective secondary use. When a Sherman platoon encountered a panther or tiger in the narrow streets of an Ardennes village or the foggy forests of the Hurtgen Forest, the lead tank would fire a WP shell directly into the face of the German monster. The shell would burst in a brilliant, blinding white explosion, splashing burning phosphorus, which burns at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and cannot be extinguished by water, all over the enemy tank's optics and vision blocks. The thick, acrid white smoke would not only blind the German gunner, rendering his superior optic sights useless, but the ventilation fans of the German tank would suck the toxic fumes and burning particles into the crew compartment. Choking, blinded, and terrified that their tank was on fire, the elite German crews would often bail out of a fully functional vehicle, coughing and retching, only to be cut down by American machine gun fire. It was a dirty, desperate way to fight, a tactic of blinding the giant rather than slaying him, but in the freezing cold of the Battle of the Bulge, chivalry was dead. The desperation reached its peak in December 1944, when Hitler launched his final gamble in the Ardennes, unleashing the heavy panzer battalions in a massive counteroffensive. American crews found themselves facing not just Panthers and Tigers, but the terrifying Tiger II, or King Tiger, a 70-ton Leviathan with frontal armor so thick that it was immune to every weapon in the Allied arsenal, except point-blank artillery or air power. In the snowy fields around Bastogne and Saint-Vith, Sherman crews reported hitting King Tigers 20 or 30 times with 76mm shells, while the German behemoths advanced implacably, crushing jeeps and half-tracks under their treads. The only salvation for the U.S. tankers came in the form of HVAP, or high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, a special round with a tungsten core that offered a slim chance of penetration. But these T rounds were in such short supply that they were rationed like gold dust, with typical tank crews receiving only 2 or 3 rounds per month. Tank commanders would hoard these precious bullets, keeping them in their shirt pockets or under their seats, saving them for the moment of absolute certainty, treating a piece of ammunition with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The broken spears of the U.S. Armored Force had forced the most mechanized army in the history to fight a guerrilla war with tanks, using smoke, shadows, and suicidal courage to hold the line against a technologically superior enemy, proving that while the American industrial machine could build thousands of tanks, it had failed to build one that could actually win a fair fight.
By March 1945, the Third Reich was in its death throes, a broken skeleton of an empire crumbling under the weight of the Allied advance. Yet its dying spasms remained lethal. The United States Army had crossed the Rhine and was pushing into the heart of Germany, but the crews of the Sherman tanks were still riding in their steel coffins, looking nervously at every pile of rubble, knowing that a single fanatical teenager with a Panzerfaust or one surviving Panther could still turn them into a torch. It was in this atmosphere of final, desperate violence that a new silhouette finally appeared on the American line, a weapon that arrived tragically late but offered a glimpse of vindication. The T-26E3, later christened the M26 Pershing. This was the great equalizer that the tankers had been screaming for since Tunisia, a 46-ton heavy tank armed with a massive 90mm high-velocity gun and protected by 4 inches of cast steel armor, a machine finally capable of standing toe-to-toe with the German Cats. However, the arrival of the Pershing was not a flood, but a trickle. Only 20 of them had been rushed to Europe as part of the secret Zebra mission, scattered among the thousands of Shermans like diamonds in a pile of gravel. On March 6, 1945, in the shadow of the twin spires of the Cologne Cathedral, one of these rare beasts, a Pershing nicknamed Eagle 7 of the 3rd Armored Division, would engage in the most famous tank duel in history, a fight captured on 16mm film that would serve as the final smoking punctuation mark to the saga of the American tanker.
The prelude to the duel was a familiar tragedy. As the American column advanced toward the cathedral square, a single German Panther lying in ambush amidst the ruins of the train station fired 2 shots that tore through a lead Sherman tank, killing 3 of its crew and severing the commander's leg. The burning Sherman sat in the intersection, a grim reminder that even at the very end of the war, the German zoo could still bite. But this time, the Americans did not have to swarm or sacrifice. They called up the Pershing. Gunner Corporal Clarence Smoyer, looking through the optics of Eagle 7, felt the heavy chassis of the new tank rumble over the cobblestones as they maneuvered to flank the Panther. For the first time in the war, an American gunner approached a German tank not with the dread of a victim, but with the confidence of a predator. As the Pershing swung into the intersection, exposing its broadside to the enemy, the German Panther commander hesitated. It was a fatal pause, born of confusion. The Pershing did not look like a Sherman. Its profile was low, its barrel long, and its muzzle brake massive. For a split second, the German crew likely mistook the American tank for one of their own, perhaps a King Tiger in the dust and smoke. Smoyer did not hesitate. He shouted, "Fire!" and depressed the foot pedal. The 90mm armor-piercing shell left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. It did not bounce. It did not shatter. It struck the Panther directly on its right side, punching through the armor with terrifying kinetic energy. The film, captured by Sergeant Jim Bates, shows the result with chilling clarity. The Panther shudders violently, dust puffing from the impact. Smoyer, taking no chances, fired again, hitting the gun mantlet and a 3rd time into the hull. The German tank didn't just stop, it died. Flames erupted from the hatches as the internal ammunition cooked off. The Ronson fate finally visited upon the enemy. The Panther burned with a ferocity that matched the thousands of Shermans it and its kin had destroyed over the years. For the American tankers watching, the sight of the burning Panther was a cathartic release, a visual proof that the technological gap had finally been closed. But as the smoke drifted over the ruins of Cologne, the triumph was laced with a bitter realization. If these tanks had been available in Normandy or the Ardennes, how many thousands of boys would still be alive? The war ended not long after, but the victory was not decided by the duel at the cathedral. It was decided by the sheer, crushing weight of American logistics. The German monsters, the Tigers and Panthers, were indeed superior fighting machines, engineering marvels that were years ahead of their time, but they were intricate, fragile thoroughbreds that required high-octane gasoline and rare spare parts that Germany no longer possessed. As the U.S. Army swept across the fatherland, they found hundreds of these terrifying giants abandoned on the roadsides, not destroyed by Pershings or Shermans, but defeated by empty fuel tanks and broken transmissions. The American Ronson, for all its flaws, had won the war through the unglamorous virtue of reliability and quantity. The Sherman started every morning. It could be repaired in a muddy field with a wrench and a hammer. There were 50,000 of them, a swarm of green locusts that simply overwhelmed the superior but finite German pride. In the final analysis, the story of the U.S. tanker in World War II is one of immense moral courage. They knew with mathematical certainty that their government had sent them to war in inferior equipment. They knew that their shells would bounce and their hulls would burn. Yet from the sands of Kasserine to the streets of Cologne, they climbed into their steel coffins day after day, cranked the engines, and drove toward the sound of the 88s. The duel at Cologne showed what the American army could have been, but the graveyards of Europe are filled with the men who fought with what they had. The Sherman tank remains a complicated symbol, a winner of wars but a killer of crews, a testament to the fact that in the brutal calculus of global conflict, good enough combined with endless supply chains is often more deadly than perfection. As the silence fell over Europe in May 1945, the surviving Shermans parked in the ruins of the Thousand-Year Reich, their painted stars covered in dust, the undisputed victors of a war they were never designed to survive.